Have you ever created a spreadsheet in Sheets and then wanted to do some adjusting of the rows and columns, maybe make the columns wider, the rows taller, maybe you even want to hide or delete some rows or columns? Well, hey, even if you're from Excel and things are slightly different, I think we're going to learn a lot, and at the end you'll be able to adjust rows and columns so that they work within your spreadsheet. Hey, I'm Terry, one of the Consumer Technology Specialists for Mid-Continent Public Library, and let's get started looking at rows and columns. The easiest way to select a row or a column is to simply take your mouse and find the column letter or the row number of the column or row that you want to select and simply click. Now with Sheets there is one caution here, and that is, let's say that I want to select column C. I want to be sure that my mouse pointer looks like the arrow that points up and to the left, and then I can click and I have selected that column, and you can tell that because I have the light blue highlighting that goes down my screen. Now this will select as a default 1,000 cells just straight down in column C. If I want to select more than one column, well, I need to be a little careful and start with that mouse pointer. So I'm going to start over here at B, where the arrow is pointing up and to the left, and then I can click and drag. And now I've selected columns B, C, and D. You do have to be a little careful because if you don't use the right mouse pointer, or if you go fairly slowly, occasionally Sheets will pick up that you're trying to move a column rather than select several columns. So watch what happens and make sure that you get that light blue highlighting where you want it to show up. Well, we can also do the same kind of thing with rows. So again, let me just come over to, say, row 4, and my mouse pointer's point needs to be right at the 4, and then I just click and it selects row 4. Now row 4 goes out to column Z, so 26 cells are selected all at one time. And then let me click off so I can again get a nice good mouse pointer. That's the arrow pointing up and to the left, and if I click and drag down, I can select more than one row at a time. Besides using your mouse to click and drag to select rows and columns, there is another way that you may find even a little easier to use, and that is to use your keyboard in combination with your mouse. So, for example, if I click on column B and I hold down the Shift key on my keyboard and then say click on column E, and notice that I'm careful to be sure to have that arrow pointing up and to the left, then because I held down the Shift key, it selects not only B and E, but it also selects C and D. So everything in between the first and the last that I clicked on. Well, I could also decide that I want to select only certain columns. So I'm going to first of all select just a cell to get off of these column selections. This time I'm going to go back up to B, select it, but I'm going to hold down my Control key so that I can click, say, column D, column F, and in this way I am very careful to select only certain columns, and I'm able to do that by using the Control key. Well, the same thing works with rows as well. So let's start with, say, row 4, and I'll just click on it. I'm going to hold my Shift key down and I'm going to click on row 9. And now that I've clicked on the first, row 4, clicked on the last, row 9, but held down my Shift key, rows 5, 6, 7, and 8 are also selected. If I decide that I only want to select specific rows, well, let me again click off here, and then let me go back to, say, row 3 and start my selection process. Hold down the Control. This time I'm going to click on, say, row 5, row 8, and row 13. And those rows are what have been selected because I used the Control key on my keyboard. Now that we've looked at selecting rows and columns, let's look at how we can change the column width and the row height. So, for example, all of these columns right now are all the same width, but they seem to be a little wide for the amount of information that is in them. I might decide to, for example, with column C, take my mouse and rest it on the right-hand side of that border between C and D. And when I do that, my mouse pointer becomes sort of this double-headed arrow where I have arrowheads that point to the left and to the right. And it even shows that I'm right on the border because I have a nice line here between the two. Well, that means that I can drag to the left or the right. I'm going to drag to the left to narrow this down a little bit. And this becomes really handy when you are asked to print a very large spreadsheet. You're trying to save as much room as possible, and so if you click and drag to the left, then you're definitely going to narrow down those columns and save yourself some room. Now, if you're really in a hurry and you need to save a lot of space, what you can do is come to the edge of a column. So I'm just going to go to the right edge of column D this time, find that same mouse pointer with the arrows pointing left and right, and you can also double click. Now, this fits the widest piece of information within that column, and it really pulls your column in just as narrow as it can be. Now, that may actually look a little too narrow, so I'm kind of tempted here to take my mouse and drag out just a little bit so I have a little bit more space between the columns. But that can be a really quick, easy fix just by using the double click. Now we can also use our right click. So let me come over to column E and do a right click on column E. And about halfway down here, it says I can resize the column. So I can click on that, and it shows me that the default for all of the columns is 100 pixels. And the only thing about this is I'm kind of guessing as to a correct size, but the nice thing is if I decide that, say, 73 is a little too narrow, but 78 is a little too wide, then I could pick, say, 75, and I can really hone in on the precise number of pixels for that particular column. Well, I'm going to take a guess here and say 70. Notice also before I press OK that I could just say fit to data. Now that's the same thing as doing a double click on that column border, but we'll just go with 70 and click OK. And that's kind of a nice width. It's still not as scrunched up as column D is, but it just has a nice balance between the white space that's available and what data there is. So that might be a possibility. Well, let's do the same thing with the rows because we can certainly do that. And as I look at this, I'm always tempted to change the height of the row 1 because that's usually where my title is. So if I come out to the row numbers and I go to the bottom of row 1, you can see that I have a very similar kind of mouse pointer. It's just that now it's pointing up and down with those little arrowheads showing me that I can drag up or down to adjust the height of that row. So let me click and drag down. I'm going to make it double width. And then for this, I would need to change the spacing within that cell so that I could center this Hearts Games Played to the center of that row rather than still at the bottom. And if I decide that, well, that didn't really gain anything, I don't really like it, then I could come back to the bottom of row 1 and click and drag up and kind of resize it. Now again, what I can do besides clicking and dragging is that I can, and let me once again pull this down, I can rest my mouse on the bottom of row 1 and double click, and it should automatically adjust to the height of the font within that particular row, so that it gives me just enough space to show all of the letters and numbers within that row and just no more extra space. What I can do though is also, just like we did with the columns, I can come out to the row number and do a right click, and well, kind of right here by my mouse, but it's a little bit more than halfway down this shortcut menu, is we can resize the row. Now the row height default is 21 pixels, which is kind of an odd number, I guess, except that this says fit to data. So maybe that is the default already, is to fit to data. So we could say specify a row height. Maybe I could say, I want it 30 instead. And it may not change it a whole lot, but let's see what happens. Let's click on OK. Yeah, and so it changed it just a little bit. So if you had a lot of information in the rows above and you want to just add a little more space before you put in the total, that might be an answer to make a slightly taller row. On occasion, you may be asked to, for example, print out a spreadsheet for someone, and that spreadsheet has among its data some sensitive or maybe even confidential information, such as phone numbers, email addresses, even social security numbers. And the person who is requesting the report doesn't need that sensitive information. They're just wanting to look at the numbers. So what you can do is temporarily hide those rows and columns that are sensitive, and then when you print the report, you can unhide those rows and columns as needed so that you have all of the data at your fingertips. So let's say that column D here has confidential information. What I can do is put my mouse on top of that letter D and then right click, and about halfway down our shortcut menu we have hide column. So now let's say that we've printed our report, and when we come back to our spreadsheet, notice that column C and column E both have arrows that are pointing out from the middle, meaning that column D is in fact missing, or at least it's hidden. And the way we get it back is, again, we have to be careful with that mouse pointer, but make sure you have the arrow that's pointing up and to the left, and click and drag over C and E, then right click, and you can unhide the columns. And so now, once again, we have C, D, and E. Well, we could do the same thing, say, with row 7, where, again, watch your mouse, make sure it's the arrow pointing up and to the left, do a right click, and we could hide the row, and we get, let me click off so you can see, so we get these arrows pointing up and down in rows 8 and 6, showing that we're missing row 7. And so again, I'm going to select 6 and 8, do a right click, and I can unhide the rows. Once in a while, you may decide that you need to insert a row or a column, or delete a row and a column. So let's see how that can be accomplished. First of all, let's say that we need to add a new person in here, and we've decided that we would like to put them, well, about where Nelson is. So if I come up to column C and do a right click, I have two choices. One is to insert a column to the left, and the other is to insert it to the right. So let's look at both. First of all, we can insert one to the left. And so remember that we clicked on Nelson, and now we've added a blank column to the left of Nelson. Well, let me do a right click, because we could also decide that, you know what, that's not what I want, so we can delete that column. Now let's do a right click on C again, and this time insert one to the right. So now we've inserted a column to the right of Nelson and between Nelson and Carrie, and we could add the person there. And again, if we decide that's not what we want, we can right click and about halfway down that column and just really below the insert options, we have delete column. Notice also that we have a clear column. So let's talk about that. Let's say that I have column D here selected and I press delete on my keyboard. Notice that it doesn't delete the column, it only deletes or clears the information that is in that column. Undo. So anytime I want to delete a column, I always want to do that right click and delete. All right, same thing here with the rows though. Let's say that I want to insert a row. So I'm going to come over to row 6 here, right click, and I can insert a row above where I've clicked or below where I've clicked. So let me insert one above. When I do that, all of the details move down one row. And then if I decide that that's not what I wanted to do and I decide to delete that row, I go back to the row where I want to delete it, do a right click, and I can delete the row. Same thing here. If I select a row and just press delete on my keyboard, all I've done is clear out the information. I've not deleted that row. So let me undo. And if I want to delete, then I would come to right click and delete. If I decide that I don't want, I'm a little leery about using delete on my keyboard, and I want to clear though the contents of that row, then I could use clear row here with the right click instead. To learn even more, be sure to go to mymcpl.org/online learning, where you will find great online resources that include Universal Class, lynda.com, and Learning Express Library. Tune in each week as we introduce new videos on a variety of tech topics. You can find us at 1 o'clock on Wednesday and Friday and 2 o'clock on Tuesday. Be sure to find us on Facebook at MCPL 360, or if you prefer, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at MCPLMO, where you can find our MCPL Consumer Technology Resources playlist.